is actually an honor for me to introduce you all to General Prakash Menon. General Prakash Menon is an army veteran and has been decorated with the gallantry awards like the Param Vishisht Seva Medal, the Ati Vishisht Seva Medal, and the Vishisht Seva Medal. General Menon joined the Indian Army in 1972 and has had extensive operation experience in commanding counter-insurgency operations in the central, northern, and southern Kashmir. He was also the Major General Staff of Indian Army's Northern Command, responsible for operations in Jammu and Kashmir, and the Commandant of the National Defense College, New Delhi. Retiring in 2011, he has still served as the military advisor and the secretary to the government of India, and the officer on special duty in the National Security Council Secretariat. Currently, General Menon is the Director of Strategic Studies Program at the Takshashila Institution. In conversation with General Menon, we have Professor Ravi Meglani. Professor Ravi Meglani is a professor of practice of management at Ahmedabad University. He is also the Director of Executive Education at Ahmedabad University. Professor Meglani has had more than 30 years of rich experience in market research, in doing market research and managing market research companies. He is at Ahmedabad University. He is inclined towards designing interdisciplinary courses which are at the intersections of consumer behavior psychology, social psychology, and neuromarketing. And I would now like to hand over to Professor Meglani to take the conversation forward. A request to our audience that please keep yourself on mute and keep writing your questions or comments in the chat box. We will come back to you around 5 o'clock to take your questions and comments, and also have a space for your interaction with General Menon. Over to you, Professor Meglani.
Thank you, Swati, and welcome, General Prakash Menon. It is, as Swati said, indeed an honor, and this is very distinctly a first for us at Ahmedabad University in the conversation series. We have had business leaders, we have had senior academics, we've had senior media and journalism people, we've had the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, we have had everyone, but today is the first that we have a general from the army here. So we are honored that we have we getting insights from someone who's brought in so much background, comes with so much background in the armed forces and also in strategic studies and understanding geopolitics of the region. So thank you, General, and welcome. And we are all keen to hear you, so I'll keep my talking to the minimum. But before we get to the topic of the day, which is to understand the situation in Afghanistan and especially what that means for India, since, as Swati read out your profile, this was the most unique and the most interesting career journey from senior positions in the army, being decorated with some of the highest awards, and then going on to be an advisor, and then going on to be a thinker of strategic studies. If for a few minutes you can take us through this journey, and many in the audience, especially our students, would be inspired by what you have done and what they can learn from it.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for this honor. It is always intoxicating for me to speak to young people, because when you are 70 years old, the ideas that you have are mostly fossilized. They normally can only be ignited by young minds who can think differently. So to get to your question, well, I served for 40 years in the Indian Army. I was commissioned as an infantry officer. And, you know, the infantry is the sword arm of the armed forces. They are the ones who has to do the heavy lifting of combat, close in with the enemy to destroy them. That's what the role of the infantry is. And I had a very interesting story when I was joining my unit, which was that time located, and I was commissioned soon after the 71 war on 31st of March 1972. The war had just finished. My unit was in a place called Budkarbu between Kargil and Leh. And I was supposed, and they gave me a warrant from the Indian Military Academy to Pathankot, because that was the northernmost railway terminus. And then from there, you're supposed to go by road. In actual fact, that because we passed out on 31st March, I should have gone to Chandigarh and flown into Leh and then joined my unit. But, that was a bureaucratic bungle. So I reached Pathankot, and they told me, no, you got to go to Chandigarh because the road is closed. Zojila is closed. Zojila is the pass, because otherwise the road route is from Pathankot to Jammu, Jammu to Srinagar, Srinagar over the Zojila pass to Kargil and to my unit. I said, fine. But it so happened that the officer was there who told me, he said, okay, it was a Saturday. He said, you hold on till Monday. We'll try and put you on an aircraft which used to fly. Packets used to fly from Pathankot to Kargil. He said, we'll try and put you on that. I said, fine. So since it was a weekend, I made a request to him, can I go to Adampur? Adampur is an Air Force station where my cousin was a fighter pilot flying Sukhois. And, they were all 71 war heroes. So I wanted to go and meet him. I said, can I go and spend the weekend? He said, yeah, go spend the weekend, come back on Sunday evening. To cut a long story short, I went to the Air Force base, joined in with a party, and then I, who was not used to liquor, drank too much. I was in no position to go anywhere the next day. So on Monday, I reached Pathankot and then went to report, started my apologies, and he cut me short. Really gave me a moral story of how Indian Army officers should actually stick to the time. He said he had sent me on my own risk, and here you are coming up on Monday. I told you to come on Sunday. So anyway, and then of course he made one more observation. I was wearing bell-bots. Bell-bots used to be the fashion those days. So he said, he asked me, which army are you from? I was wondering, what's the question? He said, Indian Army officers don't dress in bell-bots. Oh, I said, okay, right. So the thing is, at the end of that, he really abused me in all sort of, he was a Punjabi, and it was, choice Punjabi abuses were thrown at me. And at the end of it, he stopped, and this is what he said, but you're a lucky bastard, he said. So I was wondering what has happened. The aircraft which took off that morning for Kargil had crashed. So if not for the Indian Air Force and its whiskey, I won't be here to tell you the story. So that was the beginning of my journey. And then, of course, I've had a very interesting journey. I've served on the line of control. I've served in Ladakh. I've served on the Siachen Glacier as a major. And I think that was my most challenging time which I had, because it is the highest battlefield of the world. You function between 18 to 20,000 feet. It calls for all sort of mental and physical resources you can think of. But, well, I did that. And then I qualified for the type of courses. I was an instructor at the NDA as a captain. I was an instructor at the Staff College in Wellington, which is where we train our lieutenant colonels and majors. And then I became as a lieutenant general, I was the commandant of the National Defense College, which is the highest, you can say, institution directly under the Ministry of Defense, where civilians, military officers, and foreign officers actually come to train. So it is during that period when I was a captain and as an instructor, I realized that I like to teach. And I told myself that whenever I finish with the government of India, I'm going to teach. And therefore, I am teaching right now. I run a course called Defense and Foreign Affairs, which gives me the greatest of pleasure, keeps me on my feet because I have to read, I have to keep abreast, much ahead of the young minds who I teach, because they're all mostly senior people who have much more knowledge. I am 10 years from the service, so I have to keep myself updated. And of course, what happened was that during my journey as a colonel, I was that time an instructor in Staff College, and I was India had just gone nuclear, and we were having a discussion. And I was told that what the question we were discussing was, what will happen now that we are nuclear? What will happen about conventional forces? And I found that I was a single guy in the room who had a different idea. So when I popped up and said what I had to say, everybody disagreed. I argued. Then I was told to shut up. And that provoked me to actually launch my PhD journey. And that PhD took me, believe me, it took me 8 years. I did it from the Madras University. I was still in service. I took 2 years of study leave. I spent 2 years in Bangalore. I was with the National Institute of Advanced Studies. I had a project which was funded by the Department of Atomic Energy. They had a lot of money. So I traveled abroad. And then, of course, the PhD was in my head. But soon I was promoted to a brigadier, and then I was in Kashmir. There was no time to finish my PhD, and my guide was after me. He says, if you're not going to give it, your PhD is over. So finally, I finished my PhD as a Major General commanding a counterinsurgency force in South Kashmir. I'm a very early riser. That's, I think, one of the things. I used to get up very earlier than what I normally did, and I had to write it. And finally, I finished it in the year 2006. And then when I retired, I converted that into a book, which is called The Strategy Trap, India and Pakistan Under the Nuclear Shadow. So the nuclear field actually has launched me into a particular zone. And then, of course, I was the military advisor. And then I spent 5 years in the National Security Council Secretariat. So people used to ask me, "Tu karta kya hai?" So I used to tell them, it's very difficult to answer when you are in an organization like the National Security Council Secretariat, because everything is top secret there. So I finally found an answer for them. I said, it is so secret that I'm not supposed to know it myself. And that is to be my standard answer. So here I am now a teacher. I enjoy my job. I write, and that keeps me fully engaged. COVID has been very kind to me because it has given me more time than anything else. Yeah, so I consider myself blessed by God, and that's my journey.
Thank you so much, General. This is certainly very inspiring for everyone, not just our students, for all of us. A couple of things from there that I take out, and I'm sure we all take out, is that learning is a lifelong endeavor. It doesn't end when you graduate from a university. In the old days, as both of you and I from our so-called old days, there used to be the belief that we learn for the first 25 or so years of our life, then we work for the next 40 years of our life, and then we retire. I think that linear journey is gone out of the window. We are all, the way the world is changing, we all need to keep reinventing, as you rightly said, reinventing ourselves every few years, and doing PhD and sticking to it in spite of your day job and finishing it, and is something that not many people do. We all still believe that university ho gaya, now I'll live life, padhai khatam. But padhai is never khatam. We have to keep learning through our lives. So that's very good. And of course, as your first story said, the discipline and the shouting that you got from the officer, that is something, as I was saying to you before our webinar, something that we all need to learn from the armed forces. That level of discipline, if the whole country had that, we would be a different country. So maybe that's another thing that you senior people like you with that discipline background should teach the rest of us somehow. We need to learn that. So that's very good, very inspiring. I'm sure audience will have comments and questions on that. So let's now get to the topic of Afghanistan. In the title of the webinar, we kind of had a sinister phrase there, graveyard of empires. So before we zoom into what's happening in the last few years, and especially in the last few months, if you can give us a big picture view of what has happened with Afghanistan in the last 2 centuries, really, and why did it get this scary title of being the graveyard of empires, because as many people have said, though it's attributed to one or two people, as many people keep saying that if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. So what can we learn from the 200 years of Afghanistan before we get to the present day?
So actually the graveyard of empires is because of the fact that the Afghans do not like foreigners ruling over them. It is their dislike for that why Afghanistan has been a graveyard of empires. And it is possible because if you want to unite the Afghans, bring a foreigner into their midst and ask the foreigner to start bossing around. And Afghan, as you know, is a patchwork of ethnicities. You know, it's, if you actually you have to go back beyond 2 centuries, and if you just look at the ethnicities which prevail in Afghanistan, which is actually, we always think that the Pashtuns are a majority, but that is not, it's not a substantial majority. They're only about nearly 42%, and maybe less than that, because, you know, population figures, you must take it with a thing. They are the Tajiks, who are formerly from the present day Tajikistan. They are the Uzbeks. They are the Hazaras, who are originally from Iran. And actually they also bring in not only the ethnic divide, there is also the religious divide between the Shia and the Sunni. It is a Sunni majority country, but it's also got a substantial Shia minority, which is there. So it's a patchwork of ethnicities which frame Afghanistan's people. But why it combines to be the graveyard is also its geography. That it is mountainous, that you need sturdy, hardy people to live there, to survive there. And it is also surrounded by different ethnicities. Pakistan now on one side, which is a modern this thing, but what happened previously was when the great game was on, it was the Russians who actually were fed with wrong intelligence that the Britishers were actually trying to use Afghanistan to penetrate racial influential areas of Central Asia. It was not quite true, but they believed it. And therefore, whoever came there, the Britishers first, they came there so that the Russians don't go there. They fought the Anglo-Afghan wars. Well, they lost all of them, but at the end of each war, there was an agreement where the Britishers finally settled for what is called today the Durand Line, and which separated, and that is actually something which the Afghans haven't accepted, what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it actually has divided the Pashtun population between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which today as a legacy remains one of the friction points. And I can assure you that as the game is being played out now, this friction point will come to the fore sometime or the other. In fact, it's already there in terms of the Haqqani network and so on. So the Britishers came first. British Indian Army went there, and every time the Afghans managed to defeat them. And how do the Afghans fight wars? Afghans don't actually offer resistance when they know that they will not win. They simply withdraw to the mountains, wait for these guys to come in, and then they use the mountains as the basis to attack the people down below, because most of these troops which got there are unable to survive in the mountains. The Afghans can. And they have followed this pattern throughout. Even today, if you look at Panjshir Valley, which is actually north of Kabul, connects the Salang Tunnel to Tajikistan, you'll see that, okay, the Panjshiris have actually been overcome. but they've all gone off to the mountains, and you'll see them, they'll come back after some time. So the Britishers learned their lessons, finally settled, and that is where it was. That was the first great empire which shows its demise. And then, of course, came Russia. And that's very recent in terms of the fact that in 1979, they actually sent their forces in, the whole series of coups, but all the time, it is about the foreigners trying to exploit the divisions within Afghanistan polity itself. Like anywhere, wherever there is an internal division, there will be outsiders who are willing to exploit. But the question, I think, which we should be asking is, why Afghanistan? What is the importance of Afghanistan? After all, it is a landlocked country. Its importance lies in the fact is that because of its geography, it connects Central Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. Afghanistan is the junction of all these places. And if you look at Indian history, you look at the Mughal period, and before that, after all, Genghis Khan came through Afghanistan. All of them actually made their moves because that was the way to come to what was then one of the richest countries of the world, India. They all came from there because that was the way to come, because the Himalayas were formidable. The way to India was either from the west through Afghanistan, or what is now Pakistan, or through the sea lanes. And if you see all the colonialism which has taken part has followed these two continental and maritime routes. So Afghanistan's importance is in the continental part, that it provided a continental route to India. And if you sit within Afghanistan, or if you go to Afghanistan, or you talk to Afghanis, the culture which we think is our own, actually the intermixing of the culture in history is so profound and so striking, because even in language, there are common words. It's like you go to Turkey. After all, where do these people mainly came from? Turkey. If you go to Turkey and go to Ankara, Bazari, that's what they call. Now, they can say that we gave it to you, and you can say that you gave it to them, and you can have this thing. But the fact is that India was connected both to its west and through the maritime routes to different parts of the world. So Afghanistan's importance lies today in the geopolitical competition which prevails. At that time, the graveyard of the empires, there are now 3 empires which have actually, including the Americans in recent days, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it. But the fact is, they have not tolerated foreigners, and the geography helps them to do that. And therefore, they have grown up and lived mostly in friction, in tension, in war, for such a period of time that I think Afghans really wouldn't understand what peace is, except for people who actually go and live outside Afghanistan. The tortured history of Afghanistan is not because of the Afghans, but because of its geography, of its connection to Central Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. So it is a prisoner of its geography. Like all of us are prisoners of geography, so is Afghanistan. And therefore, even today, if any nation thinks, and if the Pakistanis think, that they would actually be able to keep Afghanistan under their control or under their influence, at least from a historical point of view, the Punjabi Musliman and the Pathan will finally come to blows. It is a matter of time. That's what history tells us. We simply do not know how long it is going to take. And that's why Afghanistan and its people are able to withstand, despite all the deprivation that they have, yet all empires have died there. So it's a combination of both people and geography.
Thank you. Yep, that makes a lot of things clear to us on where how we got here and why we got here. So this prisoners of geography is an amazing concept. Like Afghanistan has had so much of a troubled history, not because what's in Afghanistan so much as where is Afghanistan, and because it's at the crossroads of South Asia and Central Asia, and so everyone is interested in them as a way to get somewhere else rather than themselves. So various empires wanted that route to come to India. India has, and we'll talk about that more later, India has been wanting an influence in Afghanistan, not because of Afghanistan, but as a route to get to the newly prosperous, growing economies of Central Asia, the erstwhile Soviet republics of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. So Afghanistan is just happens to be at the wrong place and got crushed in the crossfire between various. And the other thing that I find very interesting is that level of unity and being able to thwart huge empires like Russia and the British Empire, in spite of not being one homogeneous entity. As you said, Afghanistan is made up of Pashtuns and Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazaras and various ethnic groups, and at least two religious groups of Shias and Sunnis. And in spite of that, they come together in the face of a threat from outside, which is something maybe India needs a few lessons on
But
that.
Professor, I must just interject here. You know, when I say come together, you see, the thing is that they come together in a particular context, and they can be enemies for 1 year, they can become friends in another year. They have this great ability for deal making. And especially when the Americans were, don't forget that when the Russians were defeated by the help of the rest of the world, including America, the Saudis, and so on. So foreign interference, seeking foreign interference to defeat the foreigner is also another way of how they have dealt with it.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so that gives us a big picture and a long two centuries or more than 2 centuries view. Let's come down to what many people believe is the start of the modern story of Afghanistan, which probably, at least in my view, is not the start, but very many people will still believe that 9/11 is where the whole trouble started. And we are in the 20th anniversary year of the 9/11 attacks, and which led to America and their allies getting into Afghanistan and getting caught there for 20 years. So firstly, was 9/11 the start, or was it just a symptom of something that had been brewing before that? And then if you can take us through what went right or wrong in the last 20 years since 9/11. Mm-hmm.
So what followed the withdrawal of the Russians was actually civil war for a long time. And the situation was such that the Taliban could actually come to power with the help of with Pakistan as a base, and took over power in the first iteration of the Taliban rule. And people welcomed the Taliban because what was the situation prevailing there at that time was so bad that the Taliban came with a lot of Islamic principles which they wanted to apply. And people who are actually under a civil war finally gets the Taliban to come there. Violence is reduced, by which itself they will welcome them. I mean, even today, that's the same phenomena. The fact remains, the amount of violence which is today in Afghanistan is reduced, in the sense there are no aircrafts in the air which is suddenly going to drop a bomb on your head. There are no night raids which go on, except probably the Taliban is too small to do that in many places. So the Afghan people, in one sense, were relieved when the initial thing of the Taliban came. But when they started actually trying to exert themselves, the human rights excesses, women's rights, which actually was what is there. They closed the schools, they burned the schools, education was in this thing. It was Islamic state which actually was taking that country back for centuries. And of course, it became the hub of the Al-Qaeda. They had Osama bin Laden hosted there. And then when the Twin Towers were brought down, the Americans, the Americans actually used only, there was already an opposition against the Taliban called the Northern Alliance, which was actually from the northern part of this thing, and which India supported the Northern Alliance at that point in time. And the Northern Alliance were the ones who were doing the fighting on the ground. They were very small American forces who went there for taking over the country. But the Northern Alliance was a central military force which did it with the help of a small force. Of course, that force later on expanded. But what happened? The Taliban actually ran away, like Afghans normally do. And where did they go? They went to Pakistan, where they got shelter. And over a period of time, they have now surfaced after 10 years, or maybe 20 years. 20 years. And they are back in action. So if you really look at it, the point is, it's like the Americans went there, took over that country. After that, they also lost some interest because remember, they launched another war in Iraq. They took the eye off the ball in Afghanistan. Afghanistan became a sideshow for some time. Meanwhile, the Taliban was actually recovering, reorganizing, and initially they didn't have much support of the Pakistanis, but soon the Pakistani military and the ISI realized that here is a force which they can actually use, and that is why what has happened. And in 20 years, that force has had all the support, I mean, at least for the last decade or so, had a lot of support. They were continuously harassing them. This Haqqani network and all, which Haqqani today is actually the interior minister of Afghanistan. He is a listed terrorist according to the United Nations organization. He is the interior minister of Afghanistan. And who is he? He's a Pathan from Afghanistan, a particular part of Afghanistan. And it's interesting that actually the Kandahari Pathans look down on Pathans might be, you think is a homogeneous, but in them also they have got people of a slightly higher caste variety, of a superior this thing. So Haqqani actually belongs to a little lower class. But Haqqani over a period of time has been able to mass a force. They've carried out some deadly attacks in Kabul. One of the deadly attacks which they launched was against the Indian embassy, which killed a very dear friend of mine who was a brigadier posted there along with so many other people. So the point is, while the Taliban was being helped and Taliban started operating from Pakistani soil, the American military were blowing the smoke. They were not trying to douse the fire. The fire was in Pakistan. It still remains, mostly now it is shifted, but till then, till they took over, the fire was actually burning in Pakistan. The smoke was blowing over Afghanistan. And there's no point in blowing the smoke, the fire will still keep burning. And that's what has happened. So if you look at the history now and 20 years of what they did and what they didn't do, obviously, there were a lot of deficiencies. During that period, they got the government to write a constitution. It's an interesting constitution because it does not give any space for political parties. Instead, it's got a president, it's got 2 vice presidents, and then it's got directly elected people from various. Of course, in ipso facto, all of them belong to certain factions which finally land up in parliament. So while this was being done, here was a country thousands of miles away from a different culture who has probably never understood the Afghans because they were talking in terms of counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism. They built schools which were modeled on Western schools. It had creches which actually the Afghans would never use because they don't belong to that. Even the toilets that they make were not actually suitable for them. And they didn't quite understand it. And I was once listening to a story by a former Afghan minister who said that, there was a ceremony in Kandahar and they had, the Britishers were hosting it. And everybody, the Afghans, were actually waiting for the Britishers to come. There's a period of good relationship. And then there was a movie being shown on the screen, which was actually about whales and water. And they were showing this movie to the Afghan people who had never seen such things in their life. And then came a helicopter with the Britishers. And among the Britishers, there were 4 chairs on the stage. 2 of them were women and 2 of them were men, and they went and occupied the chairs on the stage. The Britishers hardly realized how the Afghans feel about such things. Because in their view, for men to sit down below and for women to sit on the stage is culturally difficult to, they don't accept it. So it is the not understanding the Afghan people that has been at the root of the American failure, one. But that is not the only reason. Because military, when you fight a war outside your country, you don't normally lose the war in that country. You lose the war in your homeland. That is where the wars are fought. When the American people started thinking that after spending so much of money and so much of lives, you're not getting anywhere, militaries were actually being pushed in, more and more troops were going there, more and more people were dying, body bags were coming home. So eventually, the moral war was lost for the Americans in America itself. And that started a movement against the war. Like it happened in Vietnam. The same thing happened. So the point is, when all this was happening, the Americans didn't read the cards well. The Pakistanis obviously took advantage of it. But let me tell you one thing. The relationship between the Taliban and the Pakistanis were cordial, but they can never be firm. Because right now, the Taliban needs so many people. Yes, Taliban will be as good as they can to everybody. Like all of us, when we need people, we'll be good to them. Nations do the same. And therefore, let's not take this for granted that the Pakistanis are celebrating their victory in Afghanistan. They might come to rue the day. And the Americans, who probably, after all, in America, there is a war fatigue. And more than anything else, at a grand strategic level, with the rise of China, America couldn't afford to actually spend so much of resources in Afghanistan. So with the rise of China, there had to be a decision that what are we getting out of this war? Is Afghanistan going to be used as a terrorist base to again attack us? Which was fundamentally the reason why they went there. Then after going there, they started nation building. And they couldn't actually do the nation building because they didn't understand the Afghans. So the issue is that America today is war weary. But anybody else who gets into it, and the Pakistanis are now closest to that, would find themselves in trouble. At least we don't know how long the trouble will take to reach. And therefore, in a larger sense, getting the Pakistanis into the quagmire of Afghanistan, but that will be at the cost of the Afghan people, is not a bad thing for India in a strategic sense. When you have a neighbor who can be distracted by other things, he will at least not try to distract you by the type of stuff that he normally does. So I have been writing, and I've actually been saying for at least, I think my last article on this is 2 years ago, when I said that the US must withdraw from Afghanistan. They have no business to be there. Let the Afghans sort out what it is. Of course, the point at issue is I also made the argument that the Pakistanis will get in and let the Afghanis sort out the Pakistanis. They will. Matter of time.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much learning there for everyone, and hopefully for the Americans. This whole attitude which you have been commenting on is that they rush into a situation with this air of superiority without understanding the local nuances and local culture, and then get into trouble. There is something to be said there, whether it is with the Americans or with any of us in our dealings with anyone, to understand and people's hearts and minds, and winning hearts and minds rather than winning on the battlefield is far more important, because wins in the battlefield will reverse. Whenever you have a strong hand, you win, but you can't stay there, as we saw with America. They had to withdraw without having changed hearts and minds. And for changing hearts and minds, you need to understand the culture, which they failed to do. My opinion on that, I'm nowhere an expert on it, is whenever I hear the phrases war on terror, war on drugs, war on whatever, they all end badly, because they go with the air of we are the superior ones, and we'll crush the drug cartels, or we'll crush the terrorists. But that never works out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Actually, it's an interesting thing. Terror itself, I mean, after all, if you were to just look at the number of civilians killed by the Americans, both in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, they would probably be classified by the definition of killing civilians as the biggest terrorists in the world, really speaking. But the fact is, they control the media, so we don't know how many civilians really have died. But we know a hell of a lot of civilians have died because the Americans prefer to shoot from far, and they think that they have a complete command of the airspace, and yet they make so many mistakes, which just goes to show that technology gives you a certain amount of advantage, but it does not deliver victory, because deliverance of victory is about the people. Where are the people? Are the people with you or not? And you just spoke about hearts and minds. And when you say there's a war, terror is a means. You cannot launch a war on means.
Yeah,
it's a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
The war on terror itself was actually a contradiction in terms. So the fact remains is that these were political slogans used by leaders to actually lead people in a particular direction, because it catches their imagination. It tells a story which does not exist. And of course, we know that political leaders lead with stories. And if you were to actually go by, I forget the author of this, but they said that, the political leaders all over, universally, have the capability to tell so many lies that they can give solidity to wind. And that is how actually, because it is the stories, the convincing stories that makes them leaders, gives them a following. And they try to meet some of those stories, but most of them it's not. Most of them is good storytelling. And that's how political leaders are, not only in our country, everywhere. It's universal, it's human. And therefore, the story which was told to the American people where we are winning, it's a matter of time. Till such time that people started questioning it. And then we have now come to a point where a change of administration and a pullout has taken place in a manner which gives us which has given in America such a bad image of a country which has actually walked away and left people in a situation where today Afghanistan is the greatest humanitarian disaster which is taking place. Yeah. We are still talking in the United Nations. We are still talking about how that humanitarian catastrophe is. But if you just listen to what the UN people in Afghanistan are telling the whole world, that there is a famine there. There is people don't have food. The winter is about to come. It's going to be a major disaster. The people are still thinking, how do we help them out? And in between that, Pakistan and India offered 550,000 tons to be sent there of wheat. Pakistan refused to allow the Indian trucks to go. Only yesterday, the Pakistani Prime Minister has made a remark saying that we will now consider the issue. And he promised this when the Afghan Foreign Minister was in Rawalpindi yesterday. But we know that Pakistani promises and delivery, there is a whole gap in between, so we'll have to wait and watch. So there is for Afghanistan is not today, it has to be seen as a humanitarian disaster first. First, we got to resolve that before we sort out anything else.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this whole approach of which kind of smacks of the good old Hollywood Western movies of good guys, bad guys, that good guys, bad guys story is very binary, and it's never good guys, bad guys. There are shades of gray in good guys and bad guys. And that story that very often countries like America or in the old days other empires used to tell is where once you label someone bad guy, then the only option is to kill the bad guy. Then there's no conversation. You can't have a conversation if you think we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. So that lack of conversation, lack of understanding the people, as you said, and just using technology and ammunition to subdue people is a short-term strategy. It always ends badly. So let's spend a little more time now focusing on India, because so firstly, in these 20 years, when America went in first to fight terror, then to do so-called nation building, where was India? Was India had a seat at the table in that nation building? What did India do in those 20 years?
Well, both under the Hamid Karzai and the Ashraf Ghani government, India had actually a larger role to play. We have done a lot of things for the people of Afghanistan, because what remains for us, our strong point, is not about the leadership which of Afghanistan. It is the way the Afghans look at us. They consider Indians to be friends, natural friends. They have a certain amount of affinity, which provides us our strength. And pursuing that, throughout this period, India has done quite a lot in terms of building dams, providing electricity. We, in fact, we did a lot of electrification, brought electricity into Afghanistan from Uzbekistan. We are the ones who done it. We actually did, there is a circular road in Kabul which connects to different parts of the country. We have also built a road from Chabahar to called the Delaram highway. I mean, then a lot in education. We had a lot of people, we set up schools, we sent doctors, we sent teachers. We have actually got a lot of goodwill in Afghanistan. In fact, the Afghan leaders actually asked us to do so much that India didn't have. I mean, they also felt slightly disappointed that, we are asking them, but they won't give us, because that's what it is. Even in terms of providing admissions to in our education to the Afghans in our universities. So the government has actually not dealt at all in the military sphere. Instead, it has been in the sphere of social upliftment of the Afghans. We have built the parliament building there, which actually stands today. None of these facilities which they created has been under attack by the Taliban, because they are going to use it. The Afghan people know it, because Afghan people have also got some animosities which is historical against the Pakistanis. They've got different type of relations with Iran. So if you take the Hazaras, who actually are the Shias there, they have a relationship with Iran. Of course, that relationship is always entwined in Afghan politics. But the fact is, there is a unity which comes from being part of the Shia community. So India's goodwill remains largely, well, there will be a slight blemish here and there. They could probably, some of them could complain that India could have actually accommodated a lot of people when the evacuation started recently. And I think the policy of the government to issue visas only to Hindus and Sikhs of Afghan origin, I think did not behove a secular country like ours. I think that probably, but I don't think it, wouldn't have reached the Afghan people. It would be there among the politicians, so it wouldn't really make much of a difference. But the goodwill is what we have. Goodwill what will sustain. The question is, if our 20 years of what we did, and we invested a lot of money there, how do we now utilize this in a situation like this is the question which we have to answer. But before we do that, we probably have to look and see what is the situation turning out to be. It's too recent. 15th of August is when the Taliban drove into Kabul. I was hearing today on the BBC podcast a story from the Chief of Staff of Ashraf Ghani, and I must share it with you. And why actually it happened the way it was. So Ashraf Ghani at about 1 o'clock or 1:30 leaves his office. There's some briefing, they tell them what the situation is, and supposed to go home for lunch. And the people who are attending the meeting also go for lunch. And soon after lunch, the Chief of Staff doesn't know, is informed by another minister that Ashraf Ghani, with very close people around him and his security guards, have taken a helicopter and left the country. He ran away. So Afghans have one particular quality, and which is for them, if you want to fight, you have to survive first. So they will fight to run away to fight another day. You might look at it that this is really not a good thing for what it is, but this is something which Afghans have been doing for a long time, because they have been hammered by so many people from the outside. This is what the experiences taught them. First, you have to survive, then only you can fight back. So we are now in a situation where India's goodwill will be lost in the what is called the humanitarian tragedy, which is there unfolding in Afghanistan. 50,000 tons of wheat means 5,000 trucks. That's a lot of transportation which has to cross through Pakistan to go to Afghanistan. We'll see how that's going to unfold. But India is ready to provide humanitarian help, because that is all we think we can do now. So if anybody says that we have wasted our money, we didn't do it because we wanted the Afghans to actually be on our side. Afghans will never be on any side. They are two fierce, independently minded people. They will come to people and ask for their help. They've been doing that for several decades. We have also helped them a lot. In the Indian Military Academy, even today, there are a couple of 100 cadets being trained there. And large part of the erstwhile Afghan army, a lot of them have been trained here. After all, one of the leaders in the Taliban setup is a former cadet from the Indian Military Academy. Of course, he's now with the Taliban. So India's relationship, both culturally, socially, and politically, might, it may not be of consequence to the Afghan because we are not able to help them. We don't have direct access to them. But it is not something that we will forget, because as things open up, India can still say that we are around. We'll try and help you as much as we can. And in the end, what matters in the long term is the spirit, is the human spirit. The short term does not count for the human spirit so much, but these things endure over time.
Yeah, exactly. So while India did play a lot of role in in those 20 years before Trump's talks with the Taliban in Doha, and then the kind of dominoes started falling from there, and what led to the 15th of August this year. But before that, over that 18, 19 years, India had good kind of commercial relations in terms of building infrastructure and roads and so on. But more than that, I presume India's interest was not, as we talked in the beginning, not so much in Afghanistan for Afghanistan, but because that gave India a route into the Central Asian republics. So what happens to that? Because those are emerging economies with some really good commercial prospects for, and everyone is chasing the so-called stans, the Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. So is that route gone for India? How does India now build connections with Central Asia?
Yeah, actually, so what I mean, to first get to the question, why is India actually in the geopolitical game in Afghanistan? That I think requires some clarification. The point is that Afghanistan is the center where convergence of South Asia, West Asia, and Central Asia takes place. Of course, India has to be interested, as you said. It has got connectivity, and therefore India is interested in that connectivity. And that connectivity is best through Afghanistan. But if Afghanistan is destabilized, then that connectivity is affected. So that is India's geopolitical interest. Apart from the fact that we also do not want Afghanistan turning to be the base for terrorism in this part of the world. And that's something which all governments have been emphasizing. Even the recently concluded NSA hosted talks in Delhi, where the Chinese and the Pakistanis did not attend, but the Russians, the Iranians, and all the stans actually did. This was the main case. Why is the world worried about Afghanistan more? Because it might turn out to be, again, the fountainhead of terror, which can affect many countries in the world. This is what it is. But the Taliban is telling everybody, this version of the Taliban, that we will assure that this does not happen. Point is, nobody trusts the Taliban. And if we were to actually see the type of attacks which are taking place, which are being blamed on the ISK, Khorasan, we must take that with a pinch of salt. And what my intelligence friends tell me is that most of these attacks which are taking place by help from the Haqqani network. They are meant to actually send a message to the rest of the world that these terrorists are here, and if you don't help the Taliban out, these guys are going to actually spawn in Afghanistan and cause you trouble. But this is an intelligence estimate. But let us not just think of it as a conspiracy theory, because it is well within the realm of possibility. Because they say the type of attacks which the ISIS has been carrying out are not actually within their capability. Not yet. They were never of this thing. They have never carried out an attack like that. So there is probably some grain of truth. And as usual, from the sources of information, which are all mixed, and for us who are actually away sitting nicely in Bangalore and then speaking to people and reading something, we don't know what the truth is. So I must have a caveat, but this is one of the possibilities. And it makes sense for the Taliban to send the message to the world that we are better than these guys, so you better help us to sort these guys out. Because what is the Taliban seeking now? It is seeking recognition, which nobody has so far given them, not even the Pakistanis. And the Americans are completely withdrawn. They have actually given the diplomatic activity of America in this thing to Qatar. Qatar is actually going to act on their behalf. I mean, through Qatar, they will act. India, of course, has withdrawn its embassy. The only embassy which is actually functioning there are the Pakistan, Russians, and the Chinese of the major powers. Because they are the ones who, up to a point of time, believed that the Taliban is the best bet, because there is no doubt that Ashraf Ghani government was corrupt. People had lost confidence in that government and therefore provided the soil for Taliban to actually do the takeover. And the fact that he's ran away like this itself is itself a tale to tell us what he was like. So Taliban is in the movement trying to get support from the international community because of the fact that Afghanistan is in great trouble. Their banks are actually, their money has been blocked by the US. Economy is in complete doldrums. There is no administration because most of the people who ran the administrations have already taken off, left the country or in hiding because they're scared that since they worked for the previous government or worked for the Americans, the Taliban is going to come them. So even if you give aid today, one of the major problems will be how will this aid be distributed? Where is the mechanism for it? And you know, when a hungry country gets aid, you know what is going to happen? The people who will catch hold of it will actually start off to try and use it as a leverage to make money because corruption is endemic to that society. And a desperate people will behave desperately. So it's not an easy situation for Afghans, and it is not an easy situation for anybody to deal with. And they, of course, we know that the Pakistanis have been using the Afghans. So Haqqani network actually acts as an intermediary for a ceasefire to take place between the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is actually the Taliban in Pakistan, which has been attacking government, the Pakistan government. The Haqqani network of Afghanistan uses their good officers to have a ceasefire between them, because obviously they fundamentally belong to the same kind. So it's a very mixed, complex picture. There are no easy answers to it. India should at least try and convey and take all the actions to say that we are with the Afghan people. That is who matters to us. As long as we maintain that, and that is probably be the practical thing we can do, we don't have to send in an army there with a UN peacekeeping force or anything of that sort. We have to wait, watch, help the people. That should be the policy we should adopt.
To help the people, and you need access there. So we have run out of time, and there are many interesting questions. We'll get to them, but I will need to ask you one last question, which is kind of the million-dollar question everyone is asking. To be able to support the people, should India recognize the government of the Taliban and re-establish diplomatic relations? And if so, when and in what manner should that be done? Or should we stay out? Mm-hmm.
Right. Personally, for me, it's a big no in capital letters. And let me explain to you why. The Taliban has got an ideological position which already is on display. They have closed all the schools, prevented women from going to work, done exactly what they promised not to do, apart from taking revenge and carrying out killings of many people who have surrendered to them. The tiger does not change its spots. Taliban has no way of ruling this country for a long time because of its fundamental ideological position. Because the people of Afghanistan have over 20 years, remember, the young people have had a liberal education. The outlook is different. This is not like when the first Taliban went there, Taliban 1.0. This is about dealing with people who have actually experienced freedom, who have actually experienced the education which is liberal in nature. They will not tolerate the orthodoxies of religious extremism. Just look at, and the greatest, you can say, sign here is the protests of the Afghan women. It's amazing. that the small groups of women have been protesting all over Afghanistan. Of course, they have been dealt with very brutally. They have been suppressed. But we must salute those women. In these conditions, those women are protesting. And as I was listening to one of the Afghans saying that, somebody asked him, so what difference does it make whether these women are protesting? They're in such small groups. He said, we have a saying in our language. He says, with many drops, you can make an ocean. With many rocks, you can make a mountain. So I think there is, firstly, where people who are under siege will first see as to what is happening to them. Then they will lie down and try to save their lives. Along with that, they need food for subsistence. When they do not get food, and when the Taliban's repression gets worse, then the estrangement and the alienation of the people with the Taliban will get to a particular point where people will rebel. Then they will find the courage to fight back because their existence becomes intolerable. Then they are willing to die because they know that if they don't fight, there will be greater trouble. So Taliban does not have a future. It cannot have.
Yeah.
Simply
Okay.
because.
Sorry to interrupt, General. So we do need to get, but one comment on your response that with the no with a capital N, there are views, and we'll probably not get into the depths of those, that sometimes views like we sometimes need to dance with the devil, as in to do good, you sometimes need to get into bed with bad people as a bad means to a good end. So there's a view that we do need to work with the Taliban to be able to get access to then do all the good things that we are talking about. But if we do not recognize them and stay out, then there's no one on the ground to stop them. I know this is not a one-liner question, but a short answer to that before we get to questions.
So I've just given my view. I quite understand there are a lot of people in this country who speak like this. I completely disagree with them. That's what all.
Okay, all right, let's leave it at that. Okay, I think we've taken a lot of time. So Swati, over to you. I'm sure you have questions from many people.
Yeah, a lot of questions are pouring in while both of you were having the conversation. Thank you for this enriching conversation. Layer by layer, you've decoded this problem. It is not just a geopolitical problem, but at the intersectionality of so many things, culture, economy, and so on and so forth. So with your permission, General Menon, we have a few questions and few members from the audience looking forward to ask the questions directly from you. I would like to invite Sanjali. Sanjali, could you come on camera and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you, sir, for addressing us and for giving such an enlightening talk. So my question was that, do you believe that the US had some ulterior motives for invading Afghanistan? Because we've been taught that Afghanistan was invaded to root out the terrorism, but US already has a history of invading other countries to set up puppet governments that would do their bidding. So do you believe that that was a similar case with Afghanistan?
I don't think so, because the US went there because of as a reaction to the attacks on the Twin Tower, which was traced to the Al-Qaeda, which was based in Afghanistan. But let me tell you that when they went there, I don't think they would have thought beyond what initially was, first, let's get these Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, or let's get hold of the Al-Qaeda, which happened. But the point was that the Al-Qaeda themselves had already disappeared into Pakistan. And most of if you listen to the history of the Tora Bora mountains and finally how their escape took place from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and Pakistan was very much a willing partner to that. So what I'm saying is the problem of terrorism does not lie in Afghanistan, it lies in Pakistan. That is what the thing is. The Americans know it, but they could not do it because they needed the Pakistanis. They needed the Pakistanis to fight in Afghanistan. They needed the Pakistanis for other geopolitical reasons. And the Pakistanis are even now trying to convince the Americans that actually it would be good for you to recognize the Taliban. The efforts are still on. And if you see some of the, after all, the guy who actually did the negotiation, Khalilzad, he in fact sold out the Afghanis. The people of Afghan were sold out by him to the Taliban. That's what he did. I mean, it was a double cross. They didn't even involve the Ashraf Ghani government. And so they wanted to get out. And he is the only guy who found a way to get out, and selling the Afghan people to the Taliban was part of that deal. And from that point of view, the conspiracy theory, see, you must understand that history has a particular way, a trajectory by which it actually has milestones which happen on the way. So if you look at how the Americans dealt with Afghanistan, the intrusion of the Iraq war made a lot of difference to how they actually worked in Afghanistan. Finally, when they found out, and then there is always this military industrial complex within the Americans. And so let me just tell you one tidbit about this. The amount of money which the Americans have spent, which is a couple of $1 trillion in, where is all that money? All that money actually has gone back to America because the profiteering was done by what is called the military industrial complex. I mean, they actually, the Americans used to give helicopters to Afghans, but the contractors who maintain all them were all Americans. So while the price of the helicopter was not much, they took away a lot of money by all this. Everything was done by the Americans themselves. So if you look at it from that point of view, the corporate power of America and the industrial power, private industrial power of America is actually works in league with centers of power in America to make this money going in circulation. And this has happened in every war that America fights. That is the structure of how they do things. So it is not because they do it deliberately, because it is part of their structural composition. Same thing happened in Iraq. The contractors, they make you must have heard of Blackwater and so on, made a killing. I mean, they are the richest guys in the world. And some of these guys, the politicians themselves, came from that background, and the same companies actually got the contracts. I mean, if you look at Dick Cheney for that matter, I mean, his connections actually with some of these companies are very well known. But that is America. That is the way America does. It is a capitalist country, and therefore money power makes all the difference to them. And making money is fundamentally what they want.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjali. I would like to invite Professor Tanawade, who is a faculty at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. Yes, Professor Tanawade.
Thank you. Very, very interesting perspective, General Menon.
Thank you.
So a quick question in terms of, do you think that the next empire, and I'm sure there will be a next empire to wade into Afghanistan, even though 3 have already been decimated, could be China, lured by the minerals and the deposits that they have. And if that does happen in such a scenario, what kind of implications would it have for India?
Let's invite them to Afghanistan and let the Chinese actually be boiled in the soil of Afghanistan. But I don't agree with you. The Chinese are going to be very careful. Initially, they were gung-ho about going into Afghanistan and all these theories about exploitations of the minerals. The Chinese are more smarter than the others. I think they would not go into, they'll be very careful. What they will do is to use Pakistan as a proxy. They will allow Pakistan to carry the burden of Afghanistan. They will give them all the backing. And since they're already in there, the Chinese will operate through Pakistan. But to think that the Chinese will go wade into the Afghan things, as you would be knowing, even for the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is being built through Pakistan, the attacks on the Chinese itself of engineers and their people have been increasing in recent times. The Chinese are very wary of it. The next thing which will probably, and they've actually previously itself, they gave Chinese money to raise special divisions to protect this corridor. But despite all that, because it passes through territory which have inimical forces, and the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, by the way, was one of them. And then they've got another problem with the Baluchis, the Baluchi Liberation Army itself. So Chinese, from the Pakistan experience itself, would be very wary of getting directly involved in Afghanistan. If they find a chance, and if they think it is safe enough, it will always be a gamble, only then it will happen. But I don't see it happening in the near future. Proxy, Chinese have a saying, they say, to kill with a borrowed sword. And they've been doing that to us through Pakistan for a long time. They'll probably do it to the Afghanis through the Pakistanis also.
Thank you.
Thank you. May I invite Nihar for his question?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Lieutenant General.
Good evening.
I have a question about why UF left Afghanistan so hastily. I mean, it was a leadership failure, it was an intelligence failure, and they evacuated the military first and then their assets. I mean, they left tons of vehicles and aircraft and weapons there. Of course, they dismantled most of the aircraft and vehicles, but still they left the weapons in Afghanistan for free for use by Taliban and various forces. And I mean, there were several videos and pictures about the whole chaos there. When the Taliban were trying to see how to fly Black Hawk helicopters, and Taliban soldiers in a full spec of outfit, and they didn't know how to even wear a ballistic helmet correctly. So what was the reason behind the US retreat?
Okay, I think we have to sort of look at the structure of the relationship towards just before all this happened. What had happened, Americans were withdrawing progressively. They were handing over most of the operational tasks. It was the Afghan National Army which was carrying the burden of fighting the Americans, okay? And most of these air power which was in support, ground troops were not so much in support, it was air power in support. Most of this air power in support had American pilots flying some of the aircraft. But what happened was, at some stage, the Americans withdrew the maintenance people of who were keeping these air fleet up in the air. They just withdrew them. Now, as you know, these are highly technologically heavy maintenances required. You do a couple of flights, there's a whole lot of things which is done. They never taught the Afghans how to maintain it because they had contractors maintain them. They just withdrew the contractors. So the air power got actually completely neutralized. And when the air power got neutralized, the Afghan forces, and then, so this is a combination. So the Americans actually left behind, but they did not probably estimate the speed at which the takeover is going to take place. They were thinking of having a sort of planned withdrawal with Bagram as the last holdout, which is the airfield outside Kabul. And then they thought they'll take all their equipment back. But the speed at which these people came sort of undercut all that. But I can assure you, whatever they leave behind or left behind would hardly be of any use to any of them. Hardly, but not most of the things which are done can easily be actually neutralized because the Taliban does not have the capability to repair them or get it done. The people who are going to benefit would be the Pakistanis and the Chinese, who would take a lot of this equipment and learn a lot from that. That will happen. That, of course, is a loss which actually that definitely is going to take place. But the other thing which happened was the Afghan National Army, its loss is because of the fact that it was a leadership failure. When a leader runs away, when the leaders tell the army not to fight, in fact, in many places, the Afghan National Army was told that you please discuss and try and come to a deal so that you guys are safe, or you withdraw. So no fight was offered, but that is the Afghan style. They don't offer a fight because when they know they cannot win, they don't offer a fight. They run away to fight another day. So they followed that. But of course, the political failure, and as far as the intelligence failure is concerned, is huge. It's not small. And the fact that they couldn't estimate that all this will happen in such a small period of time, that is why the idea that technology can give you the type of superiority of information is also questionable, because America had complete superiority. They could have monitored any damn thing which was going to take place. But yet they could not find out that this is what is going to happen. And even if they did, they could not react fast enough. The speed just overcame them. And of course, the rest is a tragedy which has happened for such a long time that it's not funny at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. RP, you've raised your hand. You have some comment.
Yeah, thanks very much. General, it's such a pleasure to listen to you once again. It is good to be back. General, my query is that the peace talks that are not taking place, and the way India's NSA meeting, that means now even India as a state is trying to get into the domain of having some nation building or whatever you may say at that place. But my question is, with China and Pakistan so openly demonstrating their opposition to India's interest or India's initiative, how do you see that our efforts will fructify? Because I see that China, whether we like it or not, China and Pakistan are the major players when it comes to Pakistan. So how do we surmount this one, sir? What's your view?
Yeah, so it's not a nation building effort, but it's about humanitarian assistance. So our choice is, we said we can send it directly to Afghan through Pakistan. We also had a choice of actually handing over these 50,000 of wheat to the United Nations to distribute. So it's not that India, at the moment, it is about humanitarian assistance. It's nothing else but that. Here you have, there's a humanitarian tragedy there, which is unimaginable. People are selling their children to survive. I mean, that's where they are. The banks are closed. There is no money in their pockets. There's hardly any food, and the winters are already there. There's already a famine in place. So it's something, when people are short of food, you can imagine how desperate they are. So eventually, what the international community, and that's where the Americans can tightly change their stance from actually giving nothing to allowing humanitarian assistance. After all, the UN Secretary General made the appeal for assistance. There was more than nearly quite a lot of money promised, but the UN is now complaining that countries which are promised have not yet given the money. So if you just listen to what the lady who was, actually there's a gent who's the head, but the lady who was in charge in the UNAMA in Afghanistan, I mean, she's crying for help. She says, this is a horrible situation, help. But even if you get that thing there, who's going to distribute this is the other problem. So it's not so easy. India should try its best. First solve the humanitarian problem, then nation building, though, is still far away from
it. Thank you, Mr. RP. So, General Menon, we had taken permission till 5:30, but can we extend for another 10-15 minutes, because there are...
Can you make it 10 minutes, because I'm actually have to go somewhere, and you know, knowing the traffic of Bangalore, I can't take much of a chance.
Okay.
10 minutes,
yeah, sure.
Yes,
so 10 minutes, I'll keep it to 10 minutes. Mr. Babu C, you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Good evening, sir. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I mean, we get to know the insightness of this ground situation at the country. And special thanks to Ahmedabad University for organizing the same. So my question is that, considering the multi-ethnicity of this nation and the ideological differences of this Taliban, how long do you think Taliban can hold on to the, governing this country? I mean, by force or, in a democratic setup, or which is acceptable to every citizen of that country? Can you just throw some light on that, sir?
See, as I already told you, in my view, and this is my personal view, Taliban has no chance because it cannot give up its ideological base. It can do so for tactical reasons to survive, but not for the long term. For the long term, they are, in fact, what is the difference they say between the ISIS and the Taliban? The ISIS is more extremist than the Taliban themselves. So, Taliban says that we are a better variety of Islamic ideology than they are. So I don't see that they have a chance to govern for a long time. There are too many contradictions within Afghanistan, which is going to give them a hell of a lot of headache. And as the security situation deteriorates, the external actors who are trying to think that Taliban is going to rule, stability will be done and they can benefit from it, are going to withdraw, because they will find that as long as security situation does not improve, security situation in the sense that they can do economic activity there. Like somebody said, China can go in there and start using the mines, the ionic mines, to actually take out rare metals and so on. There are so many things which can be done. But the fact that the Americans did not give a sufficient distinct to the Afghan economy, and the Afghan economy is now in a terrible state, and the Chinese especially don't give money for free. They are not in the humanitarian business. That is not, they're not in that kind. They don't even say so. They might provide lip service to it. So the point at issue is, in my view, it is about how long can they hold on and what will replace them. And that is something which is difficult to say, because I would think that some opposition led by Amrullah Saleh, who's now hiding in the, he's either hiding in the mountains of Panjshir, or he's already, because they're Tajiks, he might be in Tajikistan. In fact, lot of military equipment has been flown from, when this took place, Afghan National Army has flown a lot of equipment to Tajikistan. And, there is an airport called Aini in Tajikistan, where we have our military personnel there, which operates some of those air facilities and a hospital there. So as long as our relationship with these countries surrounding them, and where Iran is a big question. So you really look at it, the Iranians are also waiting and watching. And don't forget that the Americans are now actually trying to get into a conversation with the Iranians over the JCPOA, which is the nuclear stuff. And Iranian has elected one of their hardliners as their leader a couple of months ago. He's just about going to complete 100 days. So the multiplicity of actors makes it impossible to say that what happens if the Taliban does not live. It's impossible to make that, even try to explain it to anybody, because it's difficult to explain. But we know that the contradictions within the Taliban are also too much. And Taliban is not a monolithical entity. There is some people who are more moderate, some people who are actually much more extremists, like every organization. Even the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban is complicated. It is not so simple. So with all these infirmities, I don't see Taliban actually lasting for long. Only thing, I don't know how long. That is a difficult question to answer.
Okay, thank you. One last comment and question from Ms. Pallavi. Pallavi Marjara. Are you there, Pallavi? Okay, in that case, I would request Professor Meglani.
There's nothing from me. That's my wife's name. Actually, it is Kamal Marjara.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, Professor Miglani, I will request you to give a closing remark, and then I think General Menon has a limited time with us. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, General. I'm sure there are many more questions which we were not able to get to, but as we always say, the conversation series is kind of the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. So we will keep interacting with you, General, and we'll hopefully have you back here on other topics in the near future, and we'll take more questions then. So this has been very enlightening and very educational for everyone here. I mean, one or two lessons which I think apply to all our walks of life and not just the Afghan situation is, as you very rightly put it, technological superiority doesn't guarantee success. And in our world today, we have become too focused on technology and are often forget that soft skills, the spirit, the what I keep calling the hearts and minds, and understanding people as people to people rather than guns to guns. That is where a lot of the future problems will be solved. And especially with the world moving towards AI and robots and machines taking over the world, humans will not be technologically superior, not just to other nations, but to their own machines. So our superiority will have to come from our soft skills, and which I think we at Ahmedabad University quite often try to convince our students and build soft skills, understanding people, understanding cultures, understanding society, understanding the social and cultural issues rather than just using a quantitative approach. The world has become too quantitative focused, and we think that analytics and technology will solve everything. But so that was a good lesson you gave us in the context of Afghanistan, but that applies to everything. That and the second lesson I got was the spirit. Afghanistan for centuries has never been superior in hard terms to most empires, but it has managed because of just sheer human spirit and ability to thwart threats. So thank you for all those lessons. We will let you go. On a lighter note, I was quite amused that you have fought the enemy on Siachen and Ladakh, and you are scared of Bangalore traffic. So the Bangalore traffic finally defeated you.
No, but let me end with a small story on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I had at one time, I bought, when I was doing my PhD is when I bought my flat here in Bangalore, and my wife actually belongs, born, brought up here. That's why we did that. So it was, we had a tenant for 14 years straight, one particular person, and they were really nice people. Then they went off, and then, the problem with the army was you never know actually for how long you serve, because each rank gives you 2 years, but you're not sure about your rank. So I used to tell my tenant that I don't know when I will need the house, but depends upon whether I get promoted or not. Anyway, eventually I became a lieutenant general, and then I was absorbed into the National Security Council. So I spent another 5 years there. So during that time, in the last stages, I got finally, there were 2 years left. I got a tenant who was a retired Major General, and he was looking for a house. And I told him, sir, I know that beyond this thing, I can only give it to you for 2 years. Please give me back my house. I've only got one house. They were such a lovely couple. He was 78 years old, stayed there in that. And this is what happened. So when it came to be December, they had 2 sons who were in America, where their children came to see them. So they, from the airport, the sons went to stay in a hotel. They were supposed to come home for dinner. It was about Christmas time. They started from the hotel coming towards the house, and they were gridlocked in a traffic jam of Bangalore. They spent the whole night in the car. They could not reach their parents. They had to go back to the hotel. Next day, they called the parents to the hotel and gave them an ultimatum We will not allow you to stay in a place like this. Please come back to the United States. And I lost the tenant to the traffic of Bangalore. So that's how I'm already very wary of it. And since I'm also conscious of time, I must make it to the next one in time. That's why I made that.
Yeah, sure. We will let you go and fight.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Research on, maybe you should now do a research on the geopolitics of traffic. That's our next frontier. Okay, thank you so much. And Swati, you can close this now.
Yeah, thank you, General Menon. And thanks to our audience for staying with us.